Welcome everyone to our second flipped lesson on elements of fiction. Today we are going to examine characters and characterization in our attempt to fully be able to explain what makes a story. If you look at your Cornell notes, you will see that for our focus today, we should write in characters and characterization. You can include today's date. If we look at the Q column on the left side of the page, you'll see that we'll be indicating the two types of characters. We'll be looking at character traits and its definition, characterization and its definition, two types of characterization, and methods of characterization. In our notes section, we'll be writing in definitions on the horizontal lines, including examples of our different definitions, and filling in some blanks for more thorough notes as we go along. By the end of our lesson today, you should be able to answer why characterization is important to a story. Right, so let's begin. Characters, as I'm sure you already know, are people, animals, or imaginary things that take part in the action of the story. Now, some of these can be made up, some of these can be real, but either way, they help to make our story very rich. They're the ones who are going to have the conflicts, who are going to create conflicts for each other, and who are going to add interest to our story. Now we have two main types of characters. The first type is called the protagonist. This is the main character in your story. If you think about that prefix pro, it means for or forward. The protagonist, thus, moves the story forward. And the reason that this happens is because the protagonist is the character who has the main conflict. Our last flip lesson focused in on main conflict. The protagonist must be involved in that main conflict. The second main type of character is the antagonist. This is the character against whom the protagonist struggles. Again, if we look at that prefix, ant means against. So this is the character who causes the main conflict for that main character. Now, something to keep in mind here. When we're younger, we often think of the antagonist as being the bad guy. But that's not really the case. Because sometimes antagonists don't have to be evil villains. They could just be someone who wants the same thing as the protagonist. Also, in the case of an individual versus self conflict, the protagonist and the antagonist really could be one and the same. So try to get that definition out of your head that the antagonist has to be the bad guy, whereas the protagonist has to be, quote, the good guy. Now let's talk about character traits. In studying characters, we want to figure out what these people or what these imaginary things or what these animals are all about. What makes them them? And character traits are going to be our adjectives that help to describe a character's personality. On our screen here, we have several adjectives that could be used to describe a personality, and the list goes on and on and on. When you think about a character, when you think of those words that come to mind to describe them, that is going to be the character trait. Now the key here is remembering that character traits describe what a character is like. You're not describing a physical description. So for example, saying that a character is tall or lightweight or blonde-haired is not a character trait. You want to make sure that your adjectives actually describe a personality. This brings us into characterization. This is the way an author develops a character, or how an author makes a character seem real. This can be done in one of two ways. The first is directly. This is when the author tells you something about the character. It is flat out, it is clear, there is no guessing involved. So for example, Mrs. Day was angry. Angry is describing how Mrs. Day felt. No guessing needed. The other way, however, is a little bit more interesting. We call this indirect characterization. That prefix in means not. So this is when an author is not direct with the description, but rather requires you, the reader, to make inferences based on the character's actions. And just a reminder that an inference takes evidence from the text and adds to it your background knowledge about what you know about that evidence, and that allows you to create your inference. So let's look at an example here. Mrs. Day slammed the door, glared at the class, and yelled, "Why aren't you following directions?" This statement lets us infer that Mrs. Day is angry. However, nowhere in that statement do we actually see the word angry or a synonym for angry. However, we know that people don't typically slam doors when they're in good moods, and that glaring is something that people do when they're upset, and yelling for sure is something that a teacher does when he or she is not happy. So based on what this character does here, we're able to figure out that she is angry. Now, with indirect characterization, authors develop characters through 4 methods. We can learn about a character based on what the character does. We can learn about a character based on what he or she says, what he or she thinks, and how other characters respond to that character. Let's think about it. Think about someone who you would describe as a bully. Think about what that character might do. Like an 8th grader might slam a 7th grader into a locker. We know that doesn't actually happen at Cooper, but in other schools maybe it does. Think about what a bully might say. Probably something that wouldn't be very nice. A bully might think about how they could make another person unhappy, and other characters might respond to a bully by being fearful of him or her. Right, so on your Cornell note sheet, you should have this information and examples filled in. Take some time now to think about that final question, why characterization is important to a story, and respond there. We'll go over your answers in class. Thanks for joining us.